Welcome, folks. My name is Tyler Colburn. I am the professional development consultant here with the Nova Scotia College of Social Workers, and you're joining us today for Anti-Pathologizing Clinical Social Work. It's just Thursday, December 4th. I was just talking with Jessica Castle, who's going to be leading the session, and I was like, is today Friday? Today should be Friday. Is it not Friday? It should have been Friday all week. But anyway, we're Thursday, December 4th, and we're going to get into this content, and I'm really excited for this session. I've been working with Jessica for a few months now and developing our ideas around this, and I super appreciate that this content aligns with our Safer Social Work framework, our new upcoming Code of Ethics, which everyone will have to attest to having understood as when you do your renewals. And so I'm just looking forward to this content. As you're joining, I hope that you have some cozy things with you, water, food, whatever you need for the session. But yeah, we're going to get into it. Going to begin with a land acknowledgement, and I want to acknowledge that I'm speaking from Guwagayachk, which is the Mi'kmaq name for Citadel Hill, also known as Big Pine Hill here in Chipuktuk, Halifax, and we're located on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq. The inherent rights of the Mi'kmaq were recognized in the peace and friendship treaties signed with the Mi'kmaq, Maliseet, and the Passamaquoddy peoples from 1725 to 1779. This series of treaties did not surrender Indigenous land, resources, or sovereignty to the British Empire, but instead established rules for an ongoing relationship between nations. Canada later reaffirmed the treaties in Section 35 of the Constitution Act of 1982, and they remain active to this day. I'm going to invite folks in the chat to also check in and let us know what land you're on. Bear with me as I put those in the chat. I'm going to put some other things in the chat as well. A link to this presentation, a link to our Safer Social Work framework, a link to our Code of Ethics, and also a link to this presentation. So feel free to follow along or revisit it later. As well, this presentation is being recorded, so it will be available on YouTube and sometime in the new year. So please do check in the chat. I'd love to know where you're calling in from, the land that you're on, preference for the Mi'kmaq name of the land, if you can find it on placenames.mapdev.ca, name, pronouns, what motivated you to attend today, and anything else you want to share as we start our time together. So as we acknowledge the land, I think it's really important as well for settlers like myself and for many folks to consider how we are also nature. With the forces of settler colonialism and white supremacy, neoliberalism, individualism, sometimes these co-construct or often co-construct a sense that we are here to dominate nature or to exploit nature. And it can be helpful to flip that. And so this quote from Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures really wraps it up for me. It says, understand that the earth is not an extension of our bodies, it's the other way around. So as you think about anti-pathologizing social work, we can also hold on to an awareness of the way that pathological approaches and biomedical approaches are really rooted in white supremacy and settler colonial ways of knowing and being. As we acknowledge the land, it can be helpful to invite folks to take a moment to pause in gratitude for all who have and continue to heroically care and advocate for this beautiful land. May we join them in this sacred work. And with that, I think of like land defenders and water protectors engaged in resistance here in Mi'kma'ki. I'm thinking of Hunters Mountain. I'm also thinking about folks out west at Fairy Creek. I'm thinking of Wet'suwet'en. I'm also thinking of people engaged in resistance across Turtle Island and throughout the world. Anywhere in this world, you can find Indigenous people who are engaged in resistance and resurgence, and we can join them in this work. Let us ground ourselves in the wisdom of the land-based Mi'kmaq teachings and values, letting us all begin to learn. You're invited as well to decolonize yourself and our practice in this community that we share by working for justice for all living beings as an expression of our gratitude for being here. Take a deep breath and recenter ourselves away from the violent ways colonization fills our world and fills us. And again, as we're thinking about anti-pathologizing social work and clinical social work, we also have to acknowledge the inherent violence that's within our systems that we work within, the grounding of violence within social work practice and its historical and present-day harms. You're also invited to take a deep breath and then work on letting go of the unconscious bias that is everywhere inside and out. As I hope that this session today and this critical look at social work will also help us be in better relationships with ourselves and the land. And I see folks checking in. Thank you so much. Also want to acknowledge our commitment to reparations for people of African descent. And I often say that, this is separate from a land acknowledgement, but the forces of settler colonialism are sort of like an overlapping and parallel road with the forces that led to the enslavement and displacement of people of African descent. So as we acknowledge the land and we strive for decolonization, so too we should be striving for reparations for people of African descent. If you're here at the college, that looks like 5 things. restitution, compensation, rehabilitation, satisfaction, and guarantees of non-repetition. And so if you're not familiar with reparations or maybe decolonization is sort of a newer term for you, I encourage you to engage with our standards of practice and our code of ethics, because there's two statements at the very beginning that ground the college's work in these efforts. And when we're thinking about reparations, we're really thinking about folks from the historical African Nova Scotian communities. There's 52 of them across the province. And we're thinking about the Black Loyalists, the Maroons, and the Southern American Black refugees, and the folks who have ancestry and lineage connected to these peoples, and how the legacies of these communities and these peoples have not only shifted and shaped our cultural landscape, but our political and economic one as well. And as we're thinking about anti-pathologizing social work, I wanted to bring in this quote from Ubuntu-centered practice. This is, I think her last name is Dubé. She does some work with the CASW every now and then. Really wonderful content online. And she says, because we deserve a society built for all of us without othering, minoritizing, or pushing anyone to the margins of oppression, I stand for anti-oppressive practice, intersectionality, equity, and every path that fosters collective liberation and communal wellness. Anti-oppressive practice is inherently intersectional, resisting all isms and inequities at the micro, meso, and macro levels. We get free together, united as one family. Let's resist and rebel against divide and conquer tactics. We live in very wild times. We're seeing the rise of authoritarianism, fascism, managerialism, neoliberalism, all these intersecting forces that are creating a lot of harm. And so as social workers, we're committed to striving for decolonization and social justice and equity. And so how do we do that with a lens for liberation? And this session is going to be touching on that quite a bit. Of course, this is a PD opportunity. We're at renewal season, so remember you can track this under anti-racist and anti-discriminatory practice or formal professional development. So if you still need some of your mandated required activities, this will fit within that one, or just claim it under formal. Of course, this is grounded in our code of ethics, so we're really looking at value 1, value 2, value 4, and value 7. And it touches upon all areas of the code of ethics, but in particular, thinking about the value in relationships, social justice, and then really providing culturally responsive, competent professional services. We're hoping you develop some knowledge and skills and values, or shift your understanding of some of these concepts around anti-pathologizing social work in our session today. And then finally, some framing before I pass it over to Jessica. This is from the Broccoli Seed Agreements from Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures. They say your engagement with this session may not have immediate and/or practical applications for you, and that is okay. You folks are probably coming here because you're curious about this concept of anti-pathologizing social work, and there may be content in here that you don't agree with, and that's all right. You also might need to take some time to reflect or integrate some of the lessons from this session, and that's also okay. You don't have to agree with anything presented or shared, but we ask you to be open to seeing what happens, encouraging folks, inviting folks to take responsibility for yourself by observing and learning from your conscious and unconscious responses. And it's up to you to decide how much you want to share and participate. Where this is a webinar, you have access to the chat function and Q&A. Feel free to engage in those. I can't guarantee that we'll have time for questions and answers, but what I can guarantee is that if you have questions or there are comments in the chat, we can take that and maybe turn it into another PD session or written content. And then a final reminder, we can all engage in ways that support others. So this is not a place for healing, but healing can happen here, and how we show up for each other and relate to each other matters. And with that, I'm going to go off screen, Jessica, but I'm here if you need me. Send me a little note or anything, or just trigger me by saying next slide. But over to you. I'm looking forward to this. Thank you so much for being here.
Hey, sounds good. Thanks for that introduction, Tyler, and thank you everyone for joining. Hope everyone's staying cozy and warm today. So just a little bit about myself and how I came into this work. My name's Jessica, as you know. I'm a descendant of Irish, Scottish, and English settlers. I was born and raised in Toronto and spent most of my life there before moving to Mi'kma'ki in 2021 with my partner. And I'm now living in Piktuk, Ruali, on an old fixer-upper farm property with my partner, our rescue husky, who you might see make some appearances, and our 2 laying hens. Now, when I'm not working, I can be found rock hounding, vintage treasure hunting, and attending to my hens and my dog. My path to social work was very much shaped by my early experiences growing up in a single parent, low income household that was impacted by poverty, mental health struggles, and intergenerational trauma. I also observed many systemic inequities that were visible in the predominantly low-income, working class, and immigrant communities I grew up in Toronto. And this all planted a seed of a drive to understand and alleviate human suffering at both the individual and collective levels. And that's what led me to social work. Before opening my private practice, which is called Rocky Road Counseling and Consulting, I worked in community mental health and addictions, supportive housing, the domestic violence sector, and I also spent 5 years as a full-time activist and political organizer, which might be considered a bit of a detour, but I think enriches my clinical work quite a bit. I've long noticed the connection between rising rates of mental distress and the oppressive, exploitative conditions of life under capitalism and ongoing colonial oppression, and I was never satisfied with purely biomedical explanations, which eventually led me to the world of anti-pathology. So if I could get the next slide. So let's meet someone who could walk into any of our offices or clinical settings. This is Mira. As I describe what difficulties Mira is experiencing, I want to invite everyone to just notice what words, labels, or explanations rise up into your mind. So Mira is 37. She has been experiencing persistent low mood for several months. She describes a loss of interest in hobbies and socializing. She has difficulty focusing. She experiences harsh self-blame and deep feelings of worthlessness. She feels a deep sense of hopelessness, accompanied with thoughts of not wanting to be here anymore. She constantly worries about the future, about her health, about work. She has trouble sleeping, and she repetitively experiences worst-case scenario thought spirals. So I'd love to just see a show of hands. No one will be singled out here, but I'm curious to see for who the terms depression and anxiety popped into their minds as I was describing these difficulties. If we could see some hands. And Tyler, I'm actually not sure where I can see where the hands are up.
Sorry, apologies. Yeah, I'm seeing a bunch. There's about 11 or
Okay.
13 raised here. They're using the react function with lower hands, but quite a few people are resonating with what you said.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, it's for those who are raising their hands, that is very common and not surprising. This way of interpreting distress and this terminology for describing distress is deeply embedded in our culture and in the systems that we work in. So I'm going to be challenging that culture and those systems today. So if I could just get the next slide, please. And challenging any dominant framework, including pathologizing frameworks, can be uncomfortable, right? It can unsettle familiar and long-held explanations for our own suffering, people that we care about suffering, and people that we work with suffering. So I really want to emphasize that anti-pathology does not deny the reality of distress. People absolutely experience profound, overwhelming, and even debilitating distress and resulting difficult patterns, such as, panic, disruptive relational patterns, hearing hostile voices, extreme mood swings, just to name a few. That is all very real. What anti-pathology is about inviting alternative ways of understanding and responding to these distressing experiences that don't start with the assumption that something is wrong with them. Next slide. So when we pathologize distress, we're interpreting human suffering and resulting patterns as evidence of an internal abnormality or defect inside the individual. This is most obvious in the biomedical paradigm, which frames distress as biologically based brain diseases. It sorts human experience into symptom clusters which represent medical diagnoses, and it treats those diagnoses as discrete things in themselves. What I mean when I say that is it treats them as diseases with hard boundaries, so they're each distinct from one another, and they each have distinct biological causes. Sort of like how we would look at diabetes or cancer, it would treat these different categories as mental distress. And flowing from this framework, care focuses on diagnosis, medication, and symptom control. Now, it's also possible to pathologize from a non-medical lens. For example, in some psychological or cognitive behavioral frameworks, the roots of the problem are seen to be things like distorted thinking, maladaptive behavior, or skills deficits. And so while these aren't medical explanations, they still assume dysfunction of the individual. And I'm going to be focusing more on the biomedical model because I think that is more prevalent and associated with more historical harms. But it's important to just keep in mind that pathology can show up in psychological and cognitive explanations as well. Slide. So I'm going to talk about some of the critiques and harms of the biomedical model. I'm not going to cover them all because we'd be here all day, but one of the really important critiques is that the biomedical model and biomedical framing of distress has always served oppressive and exploitative systems by pathologizing difference and resistance to dominant norms and systems. So just some historical examples. Psychiatric biomedical theories were used to legitimize colonial domination of indigenous peoples and to justify slavery. The label of hysteria was used historically to silence and control women. Queerness was pathologized as deviance up until the late 80s. Schizophrenia was weaponized against Black civil rights activists, even being nicknamed protest psychosis. And some might say, well, Jessica, these are things of the past. The diagnostic biomedical framing we have now is really neutral. And, surely it's, the framework we use now is free from these historical functions of social control. But I would say it would be a mistake to assume that. Again, just some examples. Black people today are still disproportionately diagnosed with schizophrenia. Borderline personality disorder, which is a very gendered diagnosis, is regularly weaponized against women in family and criminal courts to discredit their testimonies. And trans people still need a psychiatric diagnosis to receive gender-affirming care in many places. So another important harm of the biomedical model is that by framing distress as an internal medical problem, the biomedical model depoliticizes suffering. It obscures the social roots of distress, like poverty, racism, precarity, violence, and it instead makes the individual the target of correction, which can really prop up and reinforce systems of oppression by distracting away from them. It is also deeply entwined with for-profit systems. Pharmaceutical and insurance industries shape what counts as a disorder, what treatments are funded, and what becomes standard of care. There is a powerful profit incentive to pathologize more and more of human experience, and this has been well documented. And despite being presented as scientific, neutral, and objective, psychiatric and biomedical framing remains socially constructed and culturally bound. This is especially evident when we look at shifting diagnostic categories that have changed with cultural norms across time. And while biomedical framing is often presented to the public as hard scientific fact, it remains a theory that has not been successfully proven by the location of any reliable or testable biomarkers. Slide, please. So beyond these historical and structural issues, biomedical dominance also shapes how care is delivered and has real consequences for people receiving care. Now, for some, biomedical framing or framing their distress as an illness, it can be relieving or validating. There's also research that shows that biomedical explanations can increase stigma and exclusion, and it can result in people internalizing hopelessness because they are told that there is something inherently imbalanced or wrong with their brains. And I hear things like this all the time in my practice. People will say things like, well, I have this disorder. I know my brain just doesn't work properly. I know my brain just has a chemical imbalance and there's no way to fix that. I just have to live with it. So there's a certain kind of fatalism that can show up and act as a barrier to seeing what's really happening for a person and exploring where there's maybe room for change in their life. Now, since the biomedical model assumes that everyone with the same diagnosis has the same underlying brain disease, services rooted in this model are often designed as if one formula should work for everybody, rather than tailoring care to people's lived realities. This pairs perfectly with and reinforces austerity agendas, where effective care is equated with speed, standardization, and cost cutting. Biomedical dominance also maintains power imbalances in care. The clinician becomes the expert, while the person's own knowledge and experiences are devalued. Jennifer Poole describes this as epistemic violence, the silencing of lived experience in favor of professional authority. And none of these critiques are new. Mad pride and psychiatric survivor movements and activists have long spoken out about coercive, abusive, and discriminatory practices that are embedded within psychiatric systems. And increasingly, global bodies like the World Health Organization are starting to echo these concerns. In their 2023 guidelines, the World Health Organization emphasized that biomedical dominance leads to coercive practices, overuse of medication, and violations of the right to health, autonomy, and dignity. And they call for a global shift away from strictly biomedical approaches. Slide. This conversation matters deeply for clinical social work because how we frame distress has enormous implications for how we respond to it. Social work is ethically committed to dignity and worth of all persons, self-determination, social justice, human rights, valuing human relationships, and culturally responsive practice. And anti-oppression and person in environment frameworks are pillars of our practice. Biomedical framing is at odds with these ethical commitments and these theoretical cornerstones of our profession. Despite this, many social workers, especially those working in health systems, feel pressured to practice within biomedical frameworks. The college actually put out a report a few years ago on repositioning social work in mental health practice in Nova Scotia. And in that report, they found that many social workers end up internalizing biomedical discourse, even though they can feel the tension of how it contradicts with our ethics. That report is mentioned in my bibliography at the end of the slides. I highly recommend folks give it a read. It's very illuminating. So considering all the harms and limits of the biomedical model and the pressures of working in clinical settings that are steeped in biomedical dominance, it's really important that we as social workers are aware and intentional about how we're practicing. Anti-oppressive practice requires a biopsychosocial lens that recognizes that our bodies and minds interact constantly with our social world and that mental distress cannot be understood separately from that world. Slide, please. All right. I want to invite you all to take a moment with this tree here. And I'm just seeing someone ask what article I mentioned. If that is directed at me, I was referring to the report put out by the college on repositioning social work in mental health care in Nova Scotia, and it is listed in my bibliography. All right, so taking a moment with this tree here, we can see in the roots are some of the main systems that we live within. So capitalism, colonialism, white supremacy, imperialism, patriarchy. And in the branches are the conditions that these systems produce on a regular basis. Take a moment to notice which of these have touched your lives. And I want to acknowledge that there's some heavy stuff here, so please do whatever you need to care for yourselves, including taking a moment. Notice which of these conditions might have shaped your parents, your grandparents, or your great-grandparents' lives. And Tyler, if we could actually get that poll up now, that would be great. So for anyone willing to participate, you could just specify if you or your direct ancestors have experienced at least one of these adverse or potentially traumatic conditions listed on the slide. All right. Just gonna give it a moment. But I can already see it going kind of up and up. That so far everyone who has responded has said yes, that in some way these conditions have touched or shaped their lives or the lives of their direct ancestors. So we can minimize that or just have it in the background.
Yeah, but out of you've got 100% response rate, so pretty much everyone has responded. Yeah, thank you for offering that poll. I'll end it
Yeah,
for now.
okay. And thanks for participating, folks. Again, I know this is some heavy content. Now, not all of us will have experienced all of these conditions or the same conditions or in the same combinations. And some of us, because of our ancestry or social location, might be more shielded from some than others. But the reality is that all of us likely have been impacted by at least some of these. Because these are not exceptions. They are features of life under these systems. And we have known for decades that chronic stress and threat reshape our nervous system in very profound ways, and that these effects can echo across generations. Yet, biomedical framing is still very mainstream. When we look at this tree, we have to ask, how are we supposed to feel? Is it any mystery that distress is rising? Is it surprising that people are overwhelmed, shut down, vigilant, despairing? Slide, please. So that's where a trauma-informed anti-oppressive paradigm comes in. A trauma-informed lens recognizes that trauma and chronic stress are pervasive and produce a wide range of human threat responses in humans. The goal is to create environments that support healing rather than reenact harm through the principles of safety, trust, choice, collaboration, and empowerment. At its core, trauma-informed practice is about shifting away from the pathologizing lens of what is wrong with you to one that asks what happened to you. When we make this shift, we start to see that a lot of people's distress and resulting patterns are deeply adaptive responses to circumstances that are overwhelming, unsafe, or unjust. And an anti-oppressive, trauma-informed paradigm situates individual distress in global social and economic systems that expose millions and millions of people to chronic stressors, instability, precarity, violence, injustice, and marginalization. Slide, please. So many service settings, often unintentionally, replicate the very conditions that harmed people in the first place. So this is a chart showing both systemic and relational dynamics that can re-traumatize. And this is by the Institute on Trauma and Trauma-Informed Care. And you might notice that there's several conditions that are directly built into the biomedical model, such as being reduced to a label, non-acknowledgement of historical narratives, rigid rules, power imbalances, lack of choice, and lack of collaboration. So now I'm going to talk about some frameworks and models and practices that we can apply in clinical work that fit within a trauma-informed anti-oppressive paradigm. Slide, please. So the first is the Power Threat Meaning Framework, or PTMF. The PTMF was developed over 5 years by clinical psychologists and psychiatric survivors. So those are people who have been harmed by the psychiatric system. And it was supported by the British Psychological Society. It launched in 2018 as a non-diagnostic alternative for understanding distress. It asks 4 core questions. What has happened to you? In other words, how is power operating in your life, whether it be structural, relational, ideological, or cultural? Next, how did it affect you? What kinds of threats did this operation of power in your life create? Things like violence, danger, exclusion, rejection. What meaning did you make of these experiences? How did you understand your experiences? And lastly, what did you need to do to survive? What threat responses developed as a response to these threats? We can use these guiding questions to co-create a non-pathologizing formulation or a collaborative narrative of a client's difficulties and how they connect to their life experiences and broader context. So the PTMF can help us really understand what has shaped someone's story. If I could just get the next slide. And narrative and strength-based approaches can help people really start to change that story. So from a narrative model, difficulties develop when people internalize problem-saturated stories that are informed by dominant discourses like ableism, colonialism, saneism, or racism. When people see themselves and their lives through these dominant lenses, they might lose sight of their strengths, resiliencies, or even their values. This is an inherently non-pathologizing model because a core tenet is the problem, not the person experiencing the problem. We can complement a narrative approach with a strength-based approach that looks at people's resiliency, their strengths. So some core practices that flow from this model include externalizing the problem. So that might sound like anxiety is showing up rather than I am anxious. Deconstructing dominant discourses, that's where we help people investigate internalized messages that are rooted in systems of domination and dominant lenses. Identifying unique outcomes and highlighting strengths. This is looking at moments where the problem had less influence and a person was able to act in alignment with their values or from a place of resilience or resistance. And these create the seeds of a richer, more empowering story. So through reauthoring, we can help people construct a more empowering and compassionate narrative about their lives. Slide, please. So something I noticed early in my practice when I was drawing mainly from narrative approaches is that sometimes people can intellectually connect with or know that the old story isn't true or helpful anymore. And they might believe intellectually a new story, but still really feel stuck in the same patterns. So, for example, someone might say, Jessica, I see how diet culture has shaped my relationship with food, and I know my worth isn't defined by my weight. Like, I reject diet culture now. But I still can't help but feel guilty when I eat, even though I don't intellectually believe that. And I find myself restricting sometimes, anyways. So, this reality of stuck patterns, even when we can really intellectually um, reconstruct a new narrative, led me to experiential and nervous system informed models that focus on how meaning gets encoded implicitly. There are many brain-based and neuroscience-informed approaches that don't rely on pathology to make sense of distress. Slide, please. So, interpersonal neurobiology looks at how relationships, the brain, and the mind all shape one another. From this lens, our brains are fundamentally relational organs. Distress often emerges when core needs for safety, connection, attunement, and co-regulation are disrupted. Attachment theory, which is a cornerstone of interpersonal neurobiology, helps us understand how early caregiving relationships shape our first templates for connection. Another way of framing this is called terms of attachment. So these are the unspoken rules about what feelings, behaviors, and needs are allowed or forbidden in order to maintain connection. Each person's learned terms of attachment are highly specific and not well captured by generic categories like avoidant, anxious, and so on. And so when working from an attachment lens, it's important not to deterministically lump people into these categories and to take the time to find out what they learn specifically about what is required to maintain connection in their lives. It's also important to note that while caregiving relationships form our first templates, other relationships are impactful across the lifespan. They can be just as impactful. So peers, friends, intimate partners, workplace dynamics, communities, and culture at large. It's also important to note that attachment and relationships never exist in a vacuum. The quality of caregiving, the quality of our relationships are heavily, if not decisively, shaped by social and economic context. When we detach attachment, that's a bit of a tongue twister, from these systems, we put the blame back on individual failing and fall back into pathology. Slide, please. So, practicing from an attachment-informed lens, what does that look like? In practice, we are exploring the state of relationships in people's lives. We're looking for the presence of any confounding relational or disruptive patterns. And we're looking for past relational or attachment wounding or ruptures in their life. We're assessing for early patterns of connection and attunement. We're assessing to learn what the person's terms of attachment are. What did they learn about what is required or forbidden to access and stay in connection with others? We're also looking at the systems that shaped their attachment and relational experiences. Contextualizing early caregiving can help people make new meaning. So it's not about excusing harm, but loosening the internalized beliefs. So, for example, someone might have internalized my needs were too much or I was unworthy when my caregivers weren't able to show up for me consistently. When we can contextualize the systems that caregiving took place in, people can start to see it had nothing to do with my worth. My caregivers were strained, under-resourced, living with the impacts of intergenerational trauma. And crucially, a cornerstone of attachment-informed practice is that relational injuries are healed through relationship. So attachment-informed practice emphasizes attunement, co-regulation, and safety. We can have this happen inside the clinical setting or help people find sources of it outside. In either cases, these new relational experiences can help update old attachment learnings. And this brings us directly to the next slide on implicit learning. So implicit learning is the foundation for many of the patterns that people feel stuck in, even when they might intellectually know better. It's an unconscious process of absorbing patterns through repeated experiences, and it forms mental maps of the world that include our expectation of the world, our expectation of others, and expectations of ourselves. We all learn implicitly, and some examples of implicit learning include gravity. That might be one of the earliest forms of implicit learning. No one teaches babies about gravity, and before they even know the term, they're learning that through repeated experience. Social norms are learned implicitly, motor skills, and speech. They're siku. Also learned implicitly is how safe is it to express emotions, and where is it safe to express emotions? What to expect in relationships? What does connection require? What is dangerous? And what to expect in most situations. Our implicit maps of the world include rules, expectations, and instructions for how to react. And for the most part, this is really great. It lets us navigate our worlds efficiently. Without implicit learning, we would all be kind of stuck in a state of like permanent newbornness. Now, when maps are forged through pain or threat, they can create protective strategies that continue long after the original conditions have passed or outside of the context where they are needed. These patterns are not disordered. They're adaptations to what the system learned it had to do to survive based on what was learned and internalized implicitly. So some guiding formulation questions for practitioners include, what makes this symptom or pattern necessary? How is this symptom or pattern decreasing suffering in some way or increasing safety, well-being, or justice? What would feel risky or unsafe if this pattern or symptom were to disappear? Next slide, please. So this is an example of implicit learning. So at the bottom, you can see the implicit learning. The slightest imperfection makes me disgusting, unlovable, and will always result in abandonment and crushing loneliness. In that learning, we can see that there's both a rule about the world, imperfection equals unlovable, and we also see a prediction. It will always result in abandonment and crushing loneliness. I'd also like to point out this learning is below that dotted line and is not really in conscious awareness. What is in conscious experience tends to be the symptoms or the sticky patterns that tend to bring people to seek out mental health support. So in this instance, those are, I will strive for nothing less than perfection in everything I do, even if it runs me into the ground. And if I make the slightest mistake, I will ruthlessly criticize myself. And just notice, because the system knows on a deep implicit level, it knows that imperfection makes one unlovable. It knows that what follows is abandonment and crushing loneliness. And so because the system knows that to be true, those symptoms are necessary. Next slide, please. So there are several methods for surfacing implicit learnings and understanding the protective intentions of those sticky patterns. So one of those is parts work that is informed by things like internal family systems, schema therapy. I also know there's EMDR informed parts work. So with parts work, we are somatically tracking and dialoguing with different inner parts of ourselves that hold protective roles. And we're doing that in a way that is non-pathologizing and compassionate. With two-chair work, which comes from Gestalt therapy and emotion-focused therapy, we're having someone speak from different parts of themselves. So it's very expressive. I'm seeing someone say they love parts work. It's really good stuff. There's some methods that come from coherence therapy, which is a bit lesser known, but it has really been transforming my practice lately. So with experiential retrieval, we are having someone imaginally relive a moment where the sticky symptom or pattern appeared, and we're tracking the moment-by-moment experience of what is happening externally and what's happening internally to help someone uncover the implicit model and prediction of the system. With symptom deprivation, we are imaginally removing the symptom to see what the system expects or fears would happen when that protective strategy is not in place. I have found this to be very powerful. And with sentence completion, we're using STEM sentences to evoke implicit expectations. I'm seeing someone say, can you recommend any sources for receiving training in coherence therapy? Yes, absolutely. There is the Institute for, I want to say, Coherence Psychology. I gotta look that up. I will put something in the comments at the end. But they have very, like compared to other models of therapy, very affordable and accessible trainings. I also cannot recommend this book enough for anyone who's interested in these models. It's called Unlocking the Emotional Brain, Memory Reconsolidation and the Psychotherapy of Transformational Change. It's in my bibliography at the end of the slides, and it covers implicit learning and how to effective change in a non-pathologizing way. Really awesome stuff. So this is not a complete list of interventions that we can use by any means. It's just a few examples. But all of these sort of move away from detached intellectual discussions about our patterns and into deeply felt experiences where we're really speaking from sensations, impulses, and emotions and not just about, because that's where implicit learnings live. And once we can access those implicit learnings, we can begin to update it. Slide, please. Hey, what can be learned can be unlearned. Our brains have a built-in mechanism for updating implicit emotional learning. It's called memory reconsolidation, and I love to nerd out about it. I think it's the coolest thing ever. We all have this innate capacity for change. When an old implicit learning is activated, so it's online and it's firing, and it bumps up against a contradictory lived experience that means that the old learning can't be true, the brain can rewrite that old learning. This is an empirically existing capacity that we all have. It doesn't belong to any one model of therapy, but it can be achieved through several experiential models. I've listed some of them on the slide. This way of understanding change is non-pathologizing because it looks at how our nervous system learns from the world that we navigate. The strategies contained in difficult patterns make deep sense in the context of our lives, even if they might have unwanted consequences. And while we can't single-handedly erase systemic injustice through, one-on-one clinical work, we can support people in unlearning or rewriting these implicit learnings that were necessary at one point, but are no longer helping them. And it's really powerful to witness. Next slide, please. So there are many other frameworks and models that allow us to understand and support distress without pathologizing. This presentation is in no way meant to be exhaustive. But I hope the takeaway from the few examples that I have given is that it is entirely possible to understand and support human distress and painful patterns without pathologizing them. Now, a common question that I get when I talk about anti-pathology is, well, what about really intense or complex presentations of mental health? Surely those can only be understood or treated biomedically. And I don't have time to go into a lot of detail here, but yes, we can even support with complex or intensely distressing experiences in a non-pathologizing way. In the bottom of this slide, I have linked a non-pathologizing guide for supporting people who experience hallucinations. So highly recommend folks check that out as an example of how we can work with something that's considered very complex. We're often told this can only be viewed in a biomedical way. No, it's possible to work with in a non-pathologizing way. Next slide, please. Okay, so back to Mira. We're going to look at her difficulties now, tying this all together. From a pathologizing what's wrong with you lens, Mira would likely receive a diagnosis like depression or anxiety. The root cause of her difficulties would be seen as these disorders in her brain. But when we ask what happened to you, her difficulties start to make perfect sense. She grew up navigating chronic threat, instability, exclusion, and disempowerment, including forced migration, racist immigration processes, and many systemic barriers. Here we can see how power operated in her life and profoundly constrained her safety and belonging, which in turn reflect the threats that this power posed. Through these experiences, she internalized the narrative, I don't belong anywhere. So here we can see problem-saturated stories as well as the meaning she has made. In order to survive and tolerate overwhelming experiences that left her feeling helpless, her nervous system alternated between vigilance, worry, collapse and hopelessness, and self-blame. And these are all threat responses. Next slide. Her caregivers were under extreme stress and made it difficult to provide consistent attunement. And so one of her attachment learnings was it's safer not to rely on anybody. She formed several implicit mental maps of the world, including hope is dangerous. It's better not to risk disappointment. If I blame myself, at least I'll have some control. I don't belong. It's safer to withdraw. If I worry enough, I might prevent disaster. These patterns are not evidence of internal disorder. They are deeply adaptive and meaningful responses to overwhelming and unjust circumstances. Next slide. So where do we go from here? I'm going to talk about the different levels of change. At the micro or individual level, it's about how we show up with people, right? We can use non-pathologizing language and formulation. So instead of pathologizing language of disorder or maladaptive, we can talk about adaptations, patterns, responses. Instead of what disorder is this, or what's wrong with you, we are asking what happened? How does this make sense in the context of your life? What problem is this pattern or symptom trying to solve? And we can actively explore how patterns are protective, adaptive, or justice-seeking, even when they might come with a great cost. We can co-create meaning with people rather than impose explanations, as so often happens with the biomedical model, right? So build narratives and formulations with people grounded in their life history and narrative. Tap into insights experientially to get the answers from inside the person. We can also center relational safety and curiosity in our work, right? Treat the therapeutic relationship as an intervention. Also, part of relational safety and trust is transparency and being honest. So when we do have to use biomedical framing because of the settings we work in, for billing or for access, we can have transparent conversations with people about the benefits and limits of this framing. And we can invite clients to hold a different story alongside the narrative reflected in the chart. And very importantly, critical self-reflection, noticing what we've internalized and gently challenge any biomedical biases within ourselves. Next slide. So at the meso level, we're looking at agencies, teams, and communities. Here we can promote anti-pathology informed training to shift agency culture and programming. We can challenge pathologizing procedures and advocate for non-pathologizing assessments, documentation, and policies. We can promote reflective practice and peer support, so normalize conversations in team meetings or in supervision that are about the discomfort or tensions of working within systems that are steeped in the biomedical paradigm. This is really important. Involve service users in design and evaluation, especially those who have been harmed by psychiatric biomedical models of care. It's so important that their voices are included. And building alliances, both inter-agency and inter. So finding peers that will uphold anti-oppressive trauma-informed principles, have a network of referrals that uphold these values, all to better support folks receiving care. Next slide. And at the macro level, so systemic change, institutional change. We can push for changes to curriculum, so decentering biomedical framing in social work and curriculums, and including MAD studies and critical mental health perspectives. We can promote public literacy and awareness. So often people don't know that there are risks and drawbacks of the biomedical model, nor do they even know that there's an alternative way of framing their experiences. And informed consent, trust, and collaboration require transparency. We can challenge coercive rights violating practices, including legislation that allows these things to happen. We can advocate for the end of policies that require diagnoses for care. We can protest one-size-fits-all efficiency-based models of care and advocate for care tailored to individual needs that honors the highly specific meaning-making of each person. And we can advocate for social determinants of mental health. Ultimately, we need radical social change. Just like putting out a forest fire is important when the forest fire is raging, if that's not paired with broader actions to address climate crisis, there will only be more and more forest fires to put out. Clinical work with people in distress today is important, but ultimately our social conditions are giving rise to this widespread distress. So we can use our roles and our collective voice to push for housing, income security, food security, childcare, healthcare, and infrastructure, because we know that these are all mental health interventions as well. Next slide. So these are just some post-session reflections for folks who might want to sit with them after the session today, whether that be through supervision, conversation with peers, or your own reflective practices. Next slide. This is just my contact information. I'm happy to keep this conversation going as we don't have time for questions today. If I can answer a question within reason through email, I'd be happy to do so. And I also offer clinical consultation. And I'm going to hand it off to Tyler with the 2 minutes I have left them.
Jessica, I just have to say, like, your timing on this was perfect and wonderful job. And it was seeing so many hearts come up from the react button as you were presenting. So just want to reflect back, like, what some of the vibes and energy that people are expressing about appreciation for your content and your presence today. So just wonderful job. And I've asked people in the chat as well to just sort of, what are some things they can apply in their practice? What are they taking away, or to share anything else they want to share as we wrap up the session? And lots of love and appreciation for the insights and wisdom and critical perspectives you're bringing in this presentation today. So wonderful job. Also, I love seeing your dog.
She's beautiful.
Yeah, reminder, folks, that in the presentation link, you can see Jessica's bibliography, some references and sources. Please engage with these. This presentation will be available at any time. Of course, if you're going to use anything with the presentation that is directly attributable to Jessica, please reach out and make sure that you're asking for consent in that. But there's lots of content here from the public sphere that you can resource as well. Of course, would love to have folks fill out our evaluation form. There's a link in the chat. There's also this QR code. You will get an email later today that'll also have the link. Would love to hear your feedback on this presentation or any of the feedback you have around the PD. We're wrapping up for the year, so we're planning well into the summer now for next year, but always love to know what folks are hungry for. And this sort of critical approach to clinical social work, I think there's a real strong desire. And Jessica, you're clear, tangible things that people can apply. I know if people are hungry for it. So thanks again for doing that. I want to read this one from Robin. I'm really wanting to express so much gratitude for this presentation. It's been wonderful, highly validating, and also provoked lots of reflection for me. I'm definitely going to be taking away a renewed sense of excitement for experiential work in interpersonal neurobiology and more reflection on my use of language, particularly in documentation, and holding that tension between billing, documentation-focused language, and anti-pathologizing language. Yeah, thanks for that, Robin. I think, Jessica,
Thank
what you've
you.
done really wonderfully here is just really point at the paradoxes in social work practice. We are in inequitable, unethical, oppressive systems, and we need to be striving for better. So we're balancing both. And so I appreciate that perspective that you brought in. So again, I'm encouraging folks to wrap up or debrief or just sort of share some of the things that's coming up for them as we wrap up the session. And I often share these cards from Margot Feldman. They will be producing a new run of these out of the States if you're interested in getting your own. But this is how I see social work practice. We're dreaming up new possibilities and we're putting practice into community. And so as we sit with the lessons and insights from this content today shared by Jessica, how are you dreaming up new worlds and how are you applying them in practice? And of course, it is renewal season. Please do your renewals if you can. We have a couple more sessions coming up as well. So we have a closed group space for Indigenous and Mi'kmaq social workers tomorrow. Monday, I'll be doing a workshop on registration renewal. So if you need any support, come to that. And then we'll be wrapping up our PD for the year with a session coming out of some research from CBU, sensory reels, neurodivergence in the classroom. I'm looking forward to that one as well. But yeah, Jessica, again, great job. Thank you so much for being here. For folks, we'll have a recording available sometime in the new year so you can revisit this, but please engage with the presentation link.
Awesome. Thanks for coming, everyone. Thanks for having me.